Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Christine Ingram. I'm the local interest librarian with New Hanover County Public Library. Tonight, we meet for our second lecture of a three-part series discussing African American service members through American history in honor of Veterans Day, which will be next week. Tonight's topic is Wilmington's Black military veterans from the Civil War to World War II. Many thousands of African Americans with connections to Wilmington have answered the call to duty over the years. Some were drafted, some volunteered, and all were deserving of recognition. Who were they? Who were their families? What do we know about them? Tim Pinnick, noted genealogist and independent researcher, is seeking answers to these questions and sharing the efforts of the Wilmington African American Community Remembrance Project to discover, document, and honor these individuals. Timothy Pinnick is an accomplished researcher, popular national speaker, author of the book Finding and Using African American Newspapers, and owner of History and Genealogy Spotlight, a business specializing in assisting libraries and individuals in identifying new and used African American books relevant to the African American research process. A lover of African American history, Pinnick delivered his historical papers at the Western Historical Association Conference, Association for the Study of African American Life and History, Association for African American Historical Research and Preservation, and the Illinois History Conference. Most recently, he returned to the 2019 Association for the Study of African American Life and History Conference in Charleston, South Carolina, to deliver his second paper there. Mr. Pinnick is affiliated with a number of historical and genealogical associations. He has served in the past on the boards of the Association of Professional Genealogists, Federation of Genealogy Societies, and Genealogical Speakers Guild. Please help me welcome Mr. Pinnick. It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you. Now I gotta live up to that billing, huh? This is just a little unique to me, with me not having my slides right in front of me. So we're looking to the right. So I'm gonna try something else where I got maybe two things going here. See if I can get it to work. Yeah, I think I'm just gonna try this. So I have something a little bit more direct. We'll see if it works. But anyway, we'll be just fine. Thanks for coming out. Wilmington is my adopted home. I've been here since 2016, and I decided that I packed up pretty much everything from Illinois, lots of research, lots of different things. I said, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and put all my energies into my new home here, since we retired, my wife and I. So I'm doing lots of things now that are related to Wilmington history, discovered many interesting things, of course, 1898, but then beyond 1898. So we've been doing some things. I'm gonna explain some of them if we go through this process. And if you have any questions, I'll try to get through fast enough to where we'll have questions at the end, since 7 o'clock is quitting time around here. So one of the things I did when I first got here to try to get myself into the volunteer mode, do some things, particularly historically related to history, is I ended up becoming part of something that was called the New Hanover County Community Remembrance Project. EJI, the Equal Justice Initiative, sponsors that down in Montgomery. Some of you may have heard of them. But what we decided to do, what I joined the efforts on, was doing a soil collection. It's basically something that they're doing that has to do with social justice and terror lynching. And so since we had 1898 here, we had to figure out a way to honor them, a way to perform a soil collection ceremony here and perform a ceremony, collect the soil for the ones we could identify that had been killed in 1898. Now, we all pretty much, well, most people pretty much know that it's indeterminate the number of people that actually were killed in that time, but we had to come up with a set number for them. And so we did the research, came up with 8 individuals, and then we conducted that ceremony last November. Some of you have been there on November 6th. And so that was the first thing that they ended up doing. I became part of that organization. And we decided pretty much when we started this that we wanted to be in it for the long haul. We said, okay, we know that EJI has only 3 projects that you can do. But we said we want to do more. And so we said, let's look for other ways we could be active in the community. So one of the ways that I figured out, since I was not only the co-chair, I was also the lead researcher, finding descendants for that particular event, that we were doing all of that research and trying to find descendants and just collecting lots of information. And so that's what you see here pretty much, is that we started collecting information, and we had certain goals. One of them, the paramount one, was searching for descendants of the victims that we identified. There were 8 of them. And then we also wanted to try to find the survivors of 1898, because what we realized as we were talking and having our monthly meetings was that we wanted to find more than just the descendants of the victims. We knew and understood that everybody that was in Wilmington had been traumatized and terrorized during that time period. So everybody really that was here in 1898 had been impacted. And so we started looking for, we casted a wider net essentially, and looking for those survivors of 1898. And so that included tracking those that had left Wilmington. The 1898 report, if you've ever looked at it, details a lot of the people that had left town, that were forced out or that left on their own accord, and where they may have went. And so we wanted to track those people down to descendants of those. And then also what we had the volunteers do whenever they came and said, we want to help. We just gave them folders, gave them the name of a person, said, fill up the folder with as much information as you could. And so in that instance, you can imagine that everybody didn't necessarily complete a folder for people that we had found, or we got a descendant, we can label that one complete. And so we have lots of information that was still out there that we knew we're going to be using. And that's kind of what we ended up saying was going to be what we called phase 2. And so phase 2 for us was taking a lot of that information, taking most of the information, and now go out into the community with it. We've got something here. We wanted to go out, we wanted to empower, we wanted to enable, and we wanted to assist the community in telling their story. Because that's what we were doing. We were finding people and we were telling the story. At that particular time, we were telling the story of 1898. But again, I'm a historian. I'm not a trained historian with a PhD, but I've got a lot of experience with history and researching. And so I understood, especially from the genealogy perspective, where in a sense, all history is local, that we had a great opportunity to tell a story. And 1898 was just a pin in a timeline, and we could go backwards and we can go forward. And we could really start pulling together Wilmington's history, because I had not seen a complete history of Wilmington, but I wasn't surprised because I don't see complete histories of any particular communities. It's not an easy task to do. That's why most people shy away from it. And so one of those stories we wanted to tell, we had to say, okay, what are we going to do? Can't do everything. What are we going to look at? So we said, okay, we're going to do a couple things. And one of the things we decided to do was try to bring out those stories that are related to service, okay, military service. And so that's what we did in launching phase 2, is we got a couple things going on. One of them that's military related is called the African American Veterans Project. And I've got some cards that you can pick up at the end. But basically what we're doing is we're just trying to collect information, because you can tell a story and then you can tell a story, right? When your grandpa told a story, that was a story, right? She didn't just say when great grandpa died and when he got this, what she, all those kind of dry facts. She was telling all these interesting stories. And so that's what we need. We can dig up the information and put it in people's minds as far as time and place and events and that type of stuff. But the stories that come out of that trigger people's memories, we can't get that. Any documents, those kind of things. I say documents, meaning we're talking about World War I or World War II veterans. Did a descendant bring home or an ancestor bring home a helmet or something like that? There's just things in the family that you can at some point contribute to this, so the story can be even richer beyond just telling an oral story, but also having artifacts. Libraries and places need artifacts to put on displays. One or two things just aren't going to cut it. So if we want them and pressure them to put on displays, we need to have materials, that kind of stuff, to do that. And so that's what we're starting to do. That's what we're looking to do. And one of the things that I decided to move everything forward was to create this African American program series for veterans. And one of the other things I learned is that you just can't go in, do a program, and say, see you folks. Again, if you're going to be vested in a community, you need to be there on a regular basis where they can expect you to arrive. So next year, this time, hopefully the room will be a little fuller, but we're going to keep going. We're going to continue to march each year. And next year is going to be even more significant because it's the 125th anniversary of 1898. But like I said, today we'll be talking about more than just 1898 because Wilmington's history is more than just 1898. So here's a book. If you're not familiar with it, if you're not familiar with this book, you need to get familiar with it. If you're interested in African-American history, this is something that really, I would call it an anomaly. This is something really unique to Wilmington. Like I said, I've been around the country, lots of cities, large, medium, small, and you just don't see this kind of collection. This is actually absolutely wonderful. I couldn't believe when I first walked into the North Carolina room and saw it existed. It's called Strength Through Struggle, this book, a chronological historical record of the African-American community in Wilmington, North Carolina, from 1865 to 1950. Now, it's not going to have everybody's family in there. It's not going to have the rich biographies of everybody, but it gives you starting points. It gives me great starting points as a researcher trying to figure out what Wilmington's history is. It's very, very good at that. It gives you lots of leads, and as historians, we need leads to follow. And so it's really, really a great book. And then the chapter on military life, again, I leaned on that to help me tell the story. And that chapter has got to be over 24 pages in length. So it's really, really pretty robust. So it's a great resource. And if you're looking or thinking about researching, you need to pay attention to it. So when we talk about the Civil War, by the end of the Civil War, roughly 179,000 Black men, which is about 10% of the Union Army, served as soldiers in the U.S. Army, and another 19,000 served in the Navy. Nearly 40,000 Black soldiers died over the course of the war. However, no one has determined how many of those combatants were connected to Wilmington, right? There's been small little enclaves of information here, there, and whatever from historians, maybe somebody writing a thesis, somebody doing a little research work. I do lots of little research projects that I'm sitting at, I deposit at different places. So, but nobody really thought about that. And even if they thought about it, it's really a pretty major task to try to figure that out, okay? And so nobody's really determined how many. And part of the problem too is because of the diaspora. If everybody knows what I'm talking about, I say diaspora. It's pretty much like the spreading, the migration of people. We talk about the African diaspora quite a bit, especially because of slavery and then how African Americans ended up in different parts of the country based on the history of the United States and what was happening with cotton and other products and things like that. And so nobody's really determined that, but it's not a big surprise that they haven't determined that particular thing. Doesn't mean you don't try though. And so here's the part that I was kind of alluding to. Here's the thing I was kind of alluding to is that the history of slavery really complicates trying to do this. Okay, it's not an easy task. It's not an easy lift. Think about runaway slaves over the years. If they were here in Wilmington, born in Wilmington, somehow had a connection, they ran away. They're not advertising where they're from necessarily, and you don't necessarily know where they went. And so it's really this Underground Railroad for a reason. And so you really don't know where these people are. But if you're a historian and if you follow the logic, you know that there were people from Wilmington that ran away. And so they're in different parts of the country. But here's the thing you have to remember is once they get another generation removed, and think about it, once they get another generation removed, now these people are having children in other parts of the country. If they're in Philadelphia, for example, so what's going to be on that birth certificate? It's not going to be Wilmington. So you're going to lose the Wilmington connection as the generations go. That's what makes it difficult. You have generations of enslaved people working for the same family or families within a certain area and region. In Wilmington, like that, when you think about people that were rich and powerful, plantation owners and other wealthy merchants and things that were in Wilmington, they had a series of plantations in different places. And so again, somebody could be born in Wilmington or born on one of those plantations, then they were here, they had a connection to the area. So again, trying to track them down and figuring out who was from Wilmington and who wasn't can be quite complicated. And then the last one is really when you talk about that part of history when they cut off the importation of slaves, and now all of a sudden the domestic slave trade really picked up. And so slaves were being sold internally. And in most cases, they were being sold from the coast here, the East Coast, down along the southern part of the country and into what we know as the Deep South. They were being sold down the river, sold to the Deep South. So again, you got families that were here and all of a sudden they got split up, or as a family, they now left Wilmington and they might be in Mississippi or places like that. So that's the kind of thing that complicates the research and trying to figure things out. Now, this is a good book. I really, really like it. There's several other books out there about Wilmington history, about the Civil War and North Carolina's role more generally. But this is a really good book too. More than 5,000 North Carolina slaves escaped from their white owners to serve in the Union Army during the Civil War. And that's what makes up what we commonly hear as the USCT, or the United States Colored Troop, pretty much. And the author of this book, I really like the way he put the book together. But the author, Richard Reed, explores the story of Black soldiers from 4 regiments that were raised in North Carolina. So again, when you're trying to think about how many of those people that were actually part of these regiments, again, think about the last slide I was talking about. There's a mixture of people in there. And sure, you can bet that there's Wilmington African Americans, or people that have a connection to Wilmington, that are there. And when you talk about, I just love this stuff. When you talk about connections to Wilmington, you know, it's all going to be at various points or various lengths of time, right? There'll be people that might have been born here and then they were sold away. Might have been only 6 months old or whatever. People came into town for a short while and then moved somewhere else. So all these people have connections at different points in time, and they all have stories, because we want to know, why did they come in, or what made them come into town? And then if they left, what made them leave? Those are the stories that we really want to uncover. And so I see a couple of you were at the presentation earlier when the ladies from Fort Fisher talked about what was going on there. And so here, this is part of what's going on. We talk about the war comes to Wilmington by way of Fort Fisher. You learned in that presentation that the war, really what we were talking about, or what the build up to all of that, was Sherman's march, right? Sherman came down, he marched through the South, and then he made a pivot and he came up through the Carolinas. And so that was pretty much the beginning of the end for the Confederates. And they were just needing to cut off the gasp of them. And that was, well, where the only thing that was sustaining them for the most part was getting supplies through Wilmington. And so this was the last part. Once they cut that off, it was all over. It was all over. So that's the story they were telling you there. And so you've got these North Carolina companies that I just talked about, that Arthur Reed talked about, and others that made up that part of the Army, the Union Army, that came in and were on their way to Wilmington, again, to kind of make that melting pot even more rich with people that are coming in. Soldiers particularly that were a part of that operation, or part of that campaign. And so then that war actually did come to Wilmington, again, as they were trying to fight that military campaign, fight that battle, to close out the South and bring about that surrender. As they came up beyond Fort Fisher, then it was the Battle of Forks Road that a lot of us are familiar with too, because that's got a lot of press in the last number of years because of the book that was written in the research that was done about that battle by UNCW professor Chris Farmer. So again, when you're talking about now the war, so the war actually ends for the most part on the doorstep of Wilmington. And so you've got lots of these soldiers that are there, now they're garrisoned, they're getting released from the military. And so some of them are staying and some of them are leaving. And so again, that melting pot of who's in Wilmington gets richer and richer. So when you try to talk about that, you think about that, so you're talking about Wilmington's Civil War veterans population. Well, as I just said a second ago, right, you've got those people, we don't know who all of them are necessarily, but you got people that were part of those African-American units that came into Wilmington in that last battle. And some of them were Wilmingtonians, so they came home, and others were from other parts of the country, and then they decided to stay. So that's what you're getting, is a mixed bag when you talk about the veterans, Wilmington veterans. It's a mixed bag of soldiers waiting to be identified. Some in the city after the war, some weren't. And then there were some new residents that were discharged and remained after the surrender. this is what I'm going to be talking about next week, is that Union or that Civil War Union veteran. What happened after the war was the Union veterans started forming these organizations. When you fight in battle, you really make a certain bond that is just such a deep bond that they wanted to keep that going. And how do you keep it going? Well, let's just form an organization. And so early on, this organization called the Grand Army Republic was formed. And one of the posts, as they call them, was formed here. It was called the Joseph Abbott Post number 15. And so that's what we're going to talk about next week in more depth, the Civil War, that organization that was here in Wilmington, and try to get a handle on the people that were part of that. So the Grand Army Republic essentially was a Civil War organization of Union veterans that they accepted African American soldiers. And again, you're talking about being kind of on the cutting edge of history and being ahead of history in a way. Again, we're talking about, what time period are we talking about? Jim Crow era, right? We're talking about an era where Reconstruction in 1877 was pretty much ended, and Southern rule came back. And so to have these little enclaves within cities is pretty amazing. And having organizations that kind of buck the culture of the South and have African Americans is really pretty amazing too. And so Blacks were able to join, and it was pretty much a status thing for them, and it was a way for them to get ahead. So they joined in significant numbers, and the posts were integrated, and they were segregated. The ones in this area, of course, when you think about the South, most of them were not integrated. They didn't go that far. And so now let's talk about these military companies. This is something I didn't really know a whole lot about. I found this very interesting, but the book was just full of these different organizations that were military companies. And when you think of that in a way, it kind of makes sense, but I just didn't realize that they existed here. But they started in the Civil War, or they started after the Civil War in 1860s, pretty quickly after 1865. Whites came to accept them, but at first you can imagine, these guys drilling around in vacant lots and whatever with guns and that type of stuff. And so that wasn't something that they felt real comfortable about, trying to figure out what was going on. But when they did some investigation, what they realized is that they all weren't really developing into these crack military outfits. They were more social clubs and just different ways for African Americans to get together culturally and do different things. They had like contests, and we go out and shooting contests and all these other types of things for prizes and whatever. So it was a mixture of things. Now, some of them were more military based than others, but you can imagine some of those probably were led by veterans. Okay, and so what they kind of looked like was, and that's why some of them eventually became part of the North Carolina State Guard, which you kind of think of now like the National Guard. So eventually some of them came, but some of them were sharp enough to where they actually were leaning toward that. They were looking to do that type of stuff, to really be more of a very disciplined military operation unit and be attached to the state guard. And so to show you kind of like the variations, there was one group I came across that I found it really interesting. But mostly it was a group of Sunday school teachers and others at St. Stephen Church. And then there were lots of youth from 16 to 20 that were part of that particular group. And so it gives you a really good feel for what was going on and how they were different. So it's almost like what you think, almost like a Boy Scouts in a way, like teaching them certain skills and that kind of stuff. And again, when you saw the more stringent ones, a lot of them probably were led by former Union Army officers that were in those particular groups. So now we move to the Spanish-American War. Again, one that people don't think a lot about or spend a lot of time with, but it was a pretty significant one. And it's kind of hard sometimes to keep it separate, but there was the Spanish-American War, and then there was like the Philippine insurrection. They were like two little pieces, but they were like right behind each other. And a lot of people think it was just one thing, but really it was kind of two separate things. But for the Spanish-American War, African Americans in that fight included regular Army troops. Right? So now these are the ones, when you think about the Civil War, everybody didn't get out. Some decided they wanted to be career soldiers. So you might have heard the term Buffalo Soldiers. And so there were several units that were formed, and so they were regular Army. So after 1865, they just stayed in the service And so those were some of the units that were involved in the Spanish American War. And then there were several volunteer and National Guard units that were formed that were part of this process. And it makes sense now when we look at that or think about that, right? Because we were just talking about those military companies. Well, several of those companies got accepted into the State Guard. And so what came out of this was the 3rd Regiment North Carolina troops. Okay, they got formed. And so they were ones that were ready to fight in this particular war. And they were battle ready. They'd been sent and trained and they were ready to go. And that was the one that was formed in Wilmington. Now, in the book Strength to Struggle, they talk about, they give a lot of information about these soldiers. There's several pages listing different people that they know were in the 3rd. And so you'll see people, if you're familiar with Wilmington history, you'll see names that you recognize that are family names that have been through several generations here. And so you'll Chestnut and other ones. So you'll see names like that. And then it includes Thomas Mass, which people might be familiar with too, because he was a doctor, a physician here for many years. And so he was like the surgeon for the unit. And he was the one that was performing physicals for a lot of the ones that were passing physicals then to get into the 3rd. And for Wilmington, there were 3 companies, but B and C were the ones that were formed for a field with soldiers that came from Wilmington, North Carolina. And so I was talking earlier, I started out beginning talking about the New Hanover County Community Remembrance Project and what we were doing, trying to find descendants, that type of stuff. Well, again, part of that, what we were doing in phase 1 was trying to find people. And it's just neat when you start doing this research. It's really contagious. And I'm hoping, like we're doing a setup now, genealogy drop-in. We want people just to drop in. We just, whatever you want to do, whatever you want to find out, we'll help you find that out. But everybody doesn't want to try to get all the way back to, people in the Bible or whatever. And so people want different things. And so what's interesting, one of the descendants that we found of the 8 that were killed, the verified that were killed, he was doing a lot of research and putting family trees out there on ancestry and that kind of stuff, had done his DNA. And so he started finding people, and he was sharing those people and trying to get them to come down for the event. And one of the people he contacted was related, actually, her name was Judy, and she's in Philadelphia. And she actually had a beautiful picture of Lieutenant Richard F. Holmes. And at first she mistook it. She sent it to me. She says, she saw he was in military uniform and stuff, police, or she wasn't sure what it was. But I could see from the insignia that he was part of the Spanish-American War. And so then we got some other people here, local historians, helping her kind of put his story together. So it was really, really neat. And so she's one of the people that has a tie to Wilmington and the actual Spanish-American War, because her ancestor was one of the ones that actually was a commissioned officer at that particular time. The units never saw really any combat. And again, that probably was in part because of their color, but they didn't. And so they got disbanded. But here's the time period we're talking about. So late in 1899, after they were disbanded, not long afterwards, there was a law passed. And so that law basically was saying no longer can African-American regiments be part of the North Carolina State Guard. They just put a law and said you can't raise any more of those units. We're not interested. And so again, this gives you a sense of what was going on then, the area that they called the Jim Crow, and the types of things they were doing. And it didn't matter whether you served or not. They obviously didn't appreciate your service. So now we're going to talk about World War I. And World War I, some people call it the Great War because it really was the Great War. Nobody knew back then that it was going to be a World War I followed by World War II. So a lot of them referred to it as the Great War once it was over. And during that conflict, approximately 367,710 African Americans were drafted. So now we're getting to major drafts. So they learned their lessons from war to war. And when they saw the storm clouds on the horizon, they started instituting the draft because they knew things were probably going to heat up when they're going to be involved in the United States. And so they put a draft in, roughly 400,000 served and more than 200,000 served overseas during World War I, including a great uncle that I had. And unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to talk to him by the time I was of age and learned about it. He was well advanced in age, but I spoke to him one time and he talked about how he got gassed, which is one of the big things when he went over there, right? Was in that war was gas masks were very important because they were using that poisonous gas during that conflict. And so it was just really just to hear his voice, that age voice crackling, saying what had happened to him and how it affected him and stuff was really, really interesting. But African Americans, at least at this particular point during this venture, were sent overseas, and though lots of them didn't, most of them weren't combat units, they still were over there performing different functions. And I used to be in the military, and I tell you what, combat or non-combat, and we've learned that in wars, present wars. Jessica Lynch is a good example. You know, you could be part of a non-combat unit, but when the guys come with you with the guns, it's combat. And so if you're over in the theater, chances of you being involved increases. So anyway, so an estimated 750 African-American servicemen died in combat, and another 5,000 were wounded. And there was actually a gentleman that was in strength and struggle, and I can't think of his name right now. I think Bullock was his name, Lieutenant Bullock. And he ended up going over and dying probably about 3-4 months short of the armistice when he was killed. And they talk about that. I think the Cape Fear Museum, somebody wrote, several years ago, somebody wrote an article on the 2 or 3 people that they had documented that had been killed from Wilmington in World War I. He was one of the people. And so Wilmington connections. So people from Wilmington that were coming and being involved in World War I were like Lieutenant Bullock. They were college men or an equivalent that met the criteria to actually go to modified officer candidate school. Okay, so they could go to school and become an officer. And so there was I'm from Illinois, and most of my family, a lot of my family's from Des Moines, Iowa. So I'm very familiar with Des Moines. And so we used to have family reunions. One year we'd be in Des Moines, the other year we'd be in the Joliet area. And so I'm familiar with places, and I said I was really thrilled when we were going. I said, oh, the Fort Des Moines was here, because I realized that was the place where they started and trained the first African American officers, were at Fort Des Moines, there in this area. So I, of course, had to take a side trip when I was there from the family reunion to try to learn the history of that. And so people from Wilmington, or officers from Wilmington, when they were selected, that's where they went to train for like about 3 or 4 months, and then they were commissioned officers. And so, in addition to those officers that went to Fort Des Moines, there were scores of men, tons of men that registered and were drafted from Wilmington. And I'm finding through the records that a fair amount of them were coming to a place called Camp Green, which was outside of Charlotte, or a place near Charlotte. Some of them went to. And so, again, now you've got to think broadly, kind of think more like a researcher, think about some of the things that I talked about earlier, right? And so when you're trying to talk about women connections, we are already, I do a whole talk on migration, the migration before the Great Migration. African Americans were in motion before they were emancipated. It was forced, but then they were voluntary after 1865 or whenever they were emancipated. And so then they got on the move. And so when you really dig down and do the research, you'll find that lots of African Americans are moving all over the place. So again, we got these Wilmingtonians that are moving different places. Lots of migration going on before the Great Migration. And so that's the kind of stuff here. So you're talking about men across the country born in Wilmington, they serve. We got to go out there and try to find them. And some of the records will tell us that as we do the research and go backwards and start connecting families up. But lots of people didn't necessarily come and sign up at a local board here in Wilmington. They signed up in other places, lots of places in the north in particular, because that's where African Americans were moving. They were moving north versus south. And so those that represent the diaspora. And what I'm really finding, which is really, really neat, in documenting this information for other people when they come into the library and stuff, is that some of them were in the really, somebody had to fill up, it wasn't just like these magical people. And so there were African Americans from Wilmington that were in these really legendary type units. And like lots of times you hear people on different shows or whatever, when they're doing historical context. They talk about the Harlem Hellfighters. Well, there were people from Wilmington that were part of the Hellfighters. And it really makes sense because this was a pipeline, Wilmington to Brooklyn, Wilmington to the Bronx, Wilmington to the greater New York area. They were all over that place. And so it makes sense that if they were there and then the draft and things were happening, that then they were going in, and then the chances increased they were part of that particular unit, the Harlem Hellfighters. It's like the first time I came across that about a month or so ago, I found a guy and I just sat in my chair, I was just frozen. It was just so neat to see that person right there and documented that he said he was part of the 369. So for World War II, what we're looking at is just, again, that was huge. I mean, it was a big worldwide conflict, much bigger than we talk about World War I. It just dwarfed it in the numbers and the participants and that type of stuff. So here, what you're seeing is basically by the numbers. This is what was going on as far as the number of people. So plenty of time, plenty of opportunity for African Americans from Wilmington to serve in all the different branches. When you look here, you got over 7,000 that were participated in the Army. These are African American. 165,000 Navy, 80,000, over 80,000 in the Air Force, 17,000 in the Marines, Coast Guard. Again, we think Coast Guard, again, it makes sense here in particular, 5,000. And then for the waves and the wax, females, of course, 4,000 that they documented that had served. And so, again, I had to have this slide because I knew somebody probably gonna raise their hand and say something to the questions if I didn't. But again, those Marines that came through that were fighting, those African-Americans that were fighting to become part of the Marines because they weren't letting them in initially. I say once they were able to qualify and sign up to be Marines, you hear all the time when they're talking about Black Marines in World War II, they're talking about the Monfort Point Marines. And that's where they were. Again, the pride comes really out of all of North Carolina because that was the place where they trained, and it was right up there in the Jacksonville area, outside of Camp Lejeune, or Lejeune, or I say I like Lejeune. And so that I just had to acknowledge that, yes, that's Marine Corps guys, it was Camp Lejeune. So now we're going to get into the part of this, which is the part that gets me really excited. This is what we're doing, is we're trying to, and we're uncovering all these stories. And again, we could have another one where it just be an hour of talking about what I found. We could write those folders that I was talking about, that now in phase 2, we're opening them up and we're trying to get grant money and things like that to pay researchers, get volunteers to come in, to get all that information into a format where we can really analyze and share with people when they come through on genealogy drop-ins or start looking for their ancestors. We can surprise them in a sense and say, oh, wow, did you realize that you actually had a service member in your particular line? And it was your great uncle Fred. So we're going to look at now is what the research is showing us. Some gleanings from this, and I knew we were going to get out here at 7 o'clock, so I stopped at a certain point. I can't put too much in here, and so I'm going to go fairly quickly. But again, I want to leave time for a few questions. But this is some of the stuff we found in the research thus far. Okay, hold on. Let's see. Here we go. It's moving up here. That's okay. I think it's just going to show. Okay, maybe I'm pressing the wrong one. No.
Down.
Oh, there it is. So the question again, in the very beginning, when Christine was reading the stuff, the questions I was asking as I put this together, who are these people? We've been trying to describe who the people are that are the military veterans that we're trying to honor. Who are their families? Again, nobody does stuff in a vacuum. We always get concerned about the family. Who are the families of these veterans? The ones we're actually trying to reach out to find out, give us, as Paul Harvey used to say, I'm dating myself a little bit. It's cool. I love Paul Harvey. You don't know about the rest of the story. You want to know the rest of the story, right? And then what do we know about them? What is it that we're learning? What do we know about them through the research? What are the documents telling us? And so one of the things that we know we could count on is that racism was there. Racism was alive and well. And boy, I could have 40 slides on this. But again, this is just an example of here in 1941, the black newspaper, the Afro-American out of Baltimore, was talking about a free-for-all, something that happened here in Wilmington, North Carolina, where some civilians, some colored soldiers were basically got into it with some civilians. And essentially, I said, they were on leave, and you know, they were just disrespected, and they said enough was enough. So they got into a little skirmish that made a pretty good sized article in an African-American newspaper. And so here's something that really gives you a good example, again, of what was going on in the racism. Here's Camp Tyson, Tennessee, and this is their bulletin. So here's the camp bulletin explaining, this is, here are the procedures, this is how we operate Camp Tyson. So this is just the top part of it. But now we're going to go to the second part of it, down in the meat of it. So they're talking about all the different things. And one of the things they're talking about, of course, is seating of passengers on buses, right? So they're talking about, hey, this is, I don't know where y'all come from. We got people from the north and whatever, but we want to make it straight. We want it straight as far as what's going on here when you come across, the gate, you cross the gate in the camp. And so basically, it's like the seating of passengers. Carriers operating motor vehicles transporting passengers shall require the seating of white persons toward the front and colored persons toward the rear of such vehicles. The seating of passengers in buses operated on the reservation of Camp Tyson will conform to the law, to the above law. So basically, the laws of Tennessee are in effect, and that's what they're doing there, which is pretty, again, they say this is the kind of stuff they were facing as they were going to different places. That's one example. And this, I know you can't see this. I can email these slides to you if you just contact us. Again, it's just the stuff you go in. The stuff is there, and it's really interesting. And this is just one example of what I call a good old boy. He was lodging a complaint. So what happened is this particular gentleman, his name is Charles Mole. He was from Florida. And so when he got discharged in New Jersey and got his ticket, to go home, he was put on the same transportation as the black soldiers. And his expectation was when the Mason-Dixon line came that they were going to make them go away. But they didn't. They rode all the way down with him. So he was furious by the time he got down there. He was highly pissed to the point where he's writing articles or writing letters to the Army saying, what's going on with you guys? And essentially he was saying, I don't know what you guys are doing. It's against the laws of the state of Florida. And he sounds just like he's back in the Civil War again. He's like, I wonder why the Army allows this to continue. Could it be that the Army is now beginning to ignore state statutes and have no regard for state rights? It's got to sound familiar. So he fired off this letter to them. And so in short, so they started saying, okay, what's going on? What are we going to do? Try to figure it out. And so essentially what they basically told them is that based on the rules that are in place, it's not state rules. It's not, these are military, or not military, these are federal conveyances. So what they basically told him in this letter was, sorry, but that was not a mistake. They were on federal trains, and so we don't recognize that segregation stuff. And so they said, thanks, have a good day. Well, they're really interested. And so now we're gonna look at a Civil War veteran. This guy's named Akron Batson, and this is one of the ways, again, that you tell that you got a Civil War veteran. He's actually buried out there in the National Cemetery here in town. And so confirmation of that comes from all these different documents that we're finding. And this particular one is the interment document that shows that once he had passed, for them to order him to be interred there, and then subsequently get a headstone. And so it gives you information, if I back up for a second, it gives you information, kind of figure out what he did. He was an officer's cook, and then it gives you even where he served. He was US and US Navy, so it even tells you what ship he was on. So it gives you some information for you to try to track down. So now this particular gentleman, I said, okay, who is he? Where did he live? How was he connected to Wilmington? Was he connected to Wilmington? Because lots of people over there aren't necessarily connected to Wilmington. But this guy was in the 1870 New Hanover County census, and the post office was Rocky Point. So that was the area he was in. But look at this. I know it might be a little hard to see, but there's Batsons, there's 3 sets of them. That's really neat. So now you got the first one, Peter, he's 38. Then you got Akron, he's 30. They're probably what, brothers? And then you've got another one down here, Mordecai, he's 67, but he's white. So what do you think? Most likely, when you're researching that family, he's the most likely suspect to have owned them in 1860, if they were enslaved, which they most likely were. Here's a certificate. He liked to get married. Here's his third certificate. Married to what I'm pretty sure is his third wife. Again, clues that are in here, it's hard for you to see it, but the minister that married them, it says he was an AME Zion minister. So again, it gives you clues when you're trying to research what churches here in Wilmington to look at. That's the kind of stuff we do, look for. And so you can see he was married by an AME Zion minister, and you can see who his bride was, and then the date was 1905. Now here, I wrote this down because this was really interesting, because here we got the name of, this is a marriage license part, and so I pulled out Annie Phillips, Mrs. Annie Phillips, and she probably was married before this. And so now you see here, they give the names of her parents, Randall, Hardin, and Lydia, his wife, and they say Columbus County. Okay. So this was, again, it's stuff that you discovered, and it's really exciting. It gets me excited. This particular family, his third wife's family probably was free people of color. They probably were emancipated before slavery ended, because this is what I found in Robeson County, right next door, post office Lumberton. Here's that family. There's Randall Hardin. There's Lydia, the wife. She's not showing up because she's not born yet. She probably was just about to be born. I was pregnant with her when the census was taken in 1860s. And so you can see here, again, that the research goes on, and we want people to come in. We can share this, and then we can help them, guide them, and try to find their families and things like that. But this is the kind of stuff we're uncovering. It's really, really neat. So here's a guy from the Spanish American War. He's buried in Pine Forest. Again, some stones are really, really in bad shape. And this particular one, it reads cabin cook, U.S. Navy. So you can make that out. So again, documentation. But he's buried at Pine Forest. Not all veterans are in the national cemeteries. And so he was one of several men who volunteered to serve on a ship called the Nantucket. They called it the Monitor in May of 1898. The story to him, this guy was amazing. The story to him being struck by lightning and being shot 5 different times in his life. So they're talking about he led a charmed life. And it appears he had been a body servant in the Civil War. And that's where he got 3 of his wounds, was defending the massa during the Civil War. That's really, during the Civil War, the Spanish American War. And so that, again, that's a nice thread to try to follow and try to find out if he actually was he might have got a Confederate pension, or at least got some mention about that particular action. And so here he is. They call him Simeon here, but Simon Andrew Richardson. And it's just interesting when you read all these different obituaries and stuff. This is a really glowing one. It doesn't get much better than this. When they're talking about one of the best known and highly respected colored citizens, and he died. Got what he did for a living, and then that uprightness of character, sober living, won the respect of everyone of both races. This dude was somebody, again, if it was your ancestors, really, really cool, because they obviously had a lot of respect for this particular man. And you got to wonder what it was that sober living and whatnot. But anyway, he's 75, and then again, you can connect him to St. Stephen's Church here. This is the part I'm trying to get through to people when we start doing this about the families. It's just there's the soldiers, then there's the families. And this was something I was able to pull out, and I called it a simple stone for a life of community service. So this was actually one of his granddaughters. Her name was Essie, whose stone is here. She's over in Pine Forest. But here I was able to track and put together some things about her. Graduated from Gregory Institute, which is a big place here, in 1909. I'm pretty sure that's the case, that's her I see. Started teaching, founded in 1910, 1920, founded teaching again in 1923, located at East Wilmington School, teaching another decade, 1930. So this woman taught for 30, 40 years easily, became a principal by 1950, they will determine that, and then she died in 1967. So again, you talk about a different type of service to the community, and that's what we want to do. We want to find all this information about all these different people. So here's next one. I'm gonna give you guys time for a few questions. So here, this guy registered, but did he serve? I looked at Strength to Struggle, and he was one of 100-some Black men that were in the Third War who had registered for the draft. Registering doesn't mean they're going to pick you. It means they're going to reach in and you may get selected. And so I was researching him, and then I found him. But then, here's another record, found out he was inducted on the 3rd of August of 1918. He's on that list, and he's going to Camp Green. Okay, so we know for sure that he was. And then here's more verification. Here's his service card. It'll talk about more details about his service and that type of stuff. And so then here again, his headstone application, which is really important because he went into Pine Forest, which was a different interment. And so it was shipped to Mary Chestnut, who I figured out was his sister, and he was buried in, and then he was buried in Pine Forest. Found this interesting too. Again, if you know families here, Carrie Taylor Wright, that's a pretty well-known family. Again, I think she gave an interview or something that might be at Cape Fear Museum. And so she was involved with Pine Forest in some way, the sexton or whatever, because she was the one, whenever they buried military people, that took care of that paperwork where they interred them there. Again, these connections within the community, very, very interesting. And then this is the last one, I think, is James Henry Chase Kelly. And this example of Wilmington's diaspora that I've been talking about. So here he is. Here's his World War II registration card. Okay, again, gives you a hint that he possibly could be, but you're not sure. But when you look on here, you see he was born in Wilmington, and you find these other particulars out about him. Particularly, I see his name. I kept seeing a whole bunch of James H, then one James H.C. And now you can see it's James Henry Chase Kelly. And lots of times in these military records, you can get their full given name, which is really, really good too. And so then this is just a document that I wanted to share. What's helping us, I want to show you a wide range of documents. What's helpful is that different states did different things. In Pennsylvania, started giving out compensation for World War I and World War II veterans, giving them a bonus. And so this was rich, full of information, told you what battles he was in, all kinds of stuff. He was in some of the major battles over in France. And I learned that through this document that he filled out to get his compensation. Then this last document, I'm pretty sure it's the last document. I left that at the bottom, skip that. But again, it gave more information on him and gave, again, it's another kind of a card, these applications and things that really, really help you drill down and find out about these people more and more. So with that, got it in under the gun. Thank you very much for showing up. And I hope I educated you in some way that you hadn't, things you hadn't learned before. And we'll quickly take some questions before they shoo us out the door.
Really quick, before we do that, I'm gonna just conclude the recording portion of it, and then we can answer questions here. So thank you so much for your wonderful and very informative talk this evening. Our final lecture in the series will be on Wednesday, November 9th from 6 to 7 in the downtown library with the topic of the Grand Army of the Republic and its auxiliaries in Wilmington. We hope to see you all there, and thank you so much for joining us today.